Alright, so we are on problem 835, and we're going to focus in on target costing. And so target costing is essentially understanding how much cost can we have and hit our desired profit margin. Most of the time, we're not going to have a lot of flexibility in how much we charge because the market's going to set that. But we're going to have more ability to control our cost than our price. So what this problem does in 835 is we have a car manufacturer, and so they did some surveys, and they wanted to know, hey, what was important to customers. And so they ranked them, by safety, comfort, economy, etc. And then they also looked at the components or the function groups of the car that's going to supply these wants and figure out, hey, what's the target cost of these groups? And so what we're going to do is we're going to basically look at what the customer wants, how what they want relates to the parts that we have, and figure out what that correlation is to give the customer the most of what they want for the least amount of money. And so in this problem, so in part A, they want us to prepare an exhibit similar to exhibit 8-9, showing the percentage contributions of each function group to the categories of the customer requirements. Okay, so the first step is we want to look at the target cost and get a relative ranking on the cost. And so that is simply going to be, so for the chassis, we're going to take the cost and we're going to divide that by the total. So we'll press F4 to get an absolute reference. And so now we can just drag that down. Messed up our formatting, that's okay. Alright, so now we have the relative ranking of the cost. So other function groups is going to be the most expensive, the chassis is going to be the second most, air conditioning is going to be the least expensive. And so now we want to do the same thing with the customer requirements. So we want to get a relative ranking of what the customer wants based on importance. So exact same idea, we'll take their importance rating and divide it by the total. Then we'll lock that reference down. Then we'll drag it. Alright, so now we have the relative percentage ranking of both our cost and the customer requirements. So what else they did here was they gave us a correlation table. So since the customer ranked things based on, they want safety, they want customer comfort and convenience, economy, and etc. We don't have a safety part or an economy part. So those are going to be things that are achieved through the parts that we have. And so they gave us a correlation table that says, okay, so safety basically comes through 30% through the chassis, 10% through the transmission, 10% through the electrical system, and 50% through other function groups. And so if we were to go along and add up all of our correlations across, each one of these would equal 1. So the easiest place to see that is styling. You have 0.9 for the function groups, 0.1 for the chassis, which adds up to 1. So all these are going to add up to 1. And so what we did here, we just took their correlation table and we just put over here into Excel so we can actually work with that data. And so, all right, so now we want to do is we want to figure out basically the correlation of, between safety and the chassis, and how that relates to what the customer actually wants. So to do that, we could do it where we took say the relative ranking and multiplied that times the safety and get a percentage. Then we'd have to go through and do that math all the way across. So we can do it that way. However, Excel is really nice, and so let's use the power of Excel to actually get our numbers. Let's do a formula. Let Excel do the thinking for us. And so we're going to use the index and match functions combined. And essentially what that is it's just kind of a souped up VLOOKUP, if you're familiar with the VLOOKUP function. So a VLOOKUP function is limited on how it looks through columns and rows. And so if we combine match and index, it just becomes much more dynamic. And so we'll take a look at that here. So we start with the index function, and the index function says, okay, what table do you want to look in? And so we want to look at this information right here. And we want to make that an absolute reference, so we'll press F4 to lock that down. And so how index works is it says, hey, give me a table. Excel says, give me a table, and then tell me the row you want to look at and the column you want to look at. And so since our column and rows are going to change, this is where we use the match function. And so the match function says, tell me what you're looking for, and I'll tell you what row it shows up in, or I'll tell you what column it shows up in. And so what we want to do is we want to look in this column right here. Whoops, I'm doing it backwards. First, we want to tell it what we're looking for. We're looking for safety, and we want it to make an absolute reference actually right here in front of the O, so we just want to lock down the column, not the row. And it says, hey, okay, where do we want to look for that safety? We want to look in this list right here to find safety. And we want that to be an absolute reference. And then we want to find the exact match, so we'll do 0, and we'll close that. And so now we know what row we want to look in. Now we want to find out what column we want to look at. And so that's not going to change. We want to look in the third column over. So we'll just put a 3 right there. Close that. And so basically what we're telling it is we're saying, hey, look over here and find whatever this is, then come up to this list and find it, and then jump over to the third spot. And then we want to multiply that times our correlation. And see, just like that, we got the same 8.4% that we got earlier, except now all we have to do is just drag that across and drag that down, and we've populated the full table. So now let's go ahead and just enter some sums for okay, so as you can see, we have safety 28%, and so here we have safety at 28%, but now we divided that safety up in between the different function groups that we have based on how important each function group is related to what the customer wants. And so now we can go through, and so we took, hey, the customer says, hey, we want, 28% is our relative ranking for safety. And so now we can actually break that down into more detail. So now we can take, this is more useful to us because we, the car manufacturer can't do a lot with the information that says safety is important or economy is important from a cost perspective. So now we can understand the components that make up those things, and now we can apply our target cost to figure out what the best decision is to make. So now for the cost for each group, we already have that down. That's going to be up here. And so we had our cost there above, and now we want to put in our relative importance, and so that's what we calculated right here. And so let's go ahead, and since the information that we're looking for is going horizontally, but we want to drag it down, what we have is the transpose function. So we just want to go over here, grab that information, and then close it. And so the key with the transpose function is instead of just hitting enter, we have to hold down Control, Shift, and press enter. And so now we want to come up with a value index. And the value index is we just take our cost and divide it by the relative importance. Actually, I think that's backwards. Scratch that. It's the relative importance divided by the cost. So cost is the denominator. There we go. So now we can drag that down. And so what this is doing is we're correlating how much does it cost us to do something versus how important it is to the customer. And the way that reads is if we come up with a 1, we have an equal relationship. So if the value is 1, that means there's more importance to the customer than relative cost. So what's going to be important here is stuff we want to focus on is something that has a value index above 1. If it has a value index below 1, then that's saying, hey, that's expensive to us to do it and not that important to the customer. So we can punch in our implied action here. And since we're having fun with formulas, let's just go ahead and program a formula in to do it so we don't have a hard static number. So to do that, let's just do an if function, and we'll say if this is going to be greater than or equal to 1, we want to enhance it. And if that's false or below 1, we want to focus on reducing cost. So perfect. So now we can look at this and say, hey, if we look at our function groups, or our, the stuff that we can choose that we can actually make better, or maybe make less expensive. Now we know how important that is to the customer. Now we know whether to say, do we spend more money on this to make it better, or maybe there's some areas we can cut back in because the customer doesn't really care about it. So, for example, the electrical system. From a customer point of view, they're not really concerned about the electrical system. They just want stuff to work. And so, but from a cost perspective, that's actually kind of expensive to us. So maybe we don't want to spend a ton of money on it. However, we have something like the air conditioner. And so the air conditioner doesn't have very much cost to us, and it really doesn't have much importance to the employee or to the customer. But from a cost benefit standpoint of view, hey, maybe it makes sense to actually have, put some money in that and make it a little bit better. So anyway, kind of a fun little problem, good for decision making, and kind of a fun little Excel exercise.